Welcome to another virtual tour. This is the Four Kingdoms Tour. The Four Kingdoms Tour is a very special and unique perspective on the four empires, the four kingdoms that ruled over Yerushalayim from the first and second Batei Mikdash. We have Bavel, who destroyed the Bet HaMikdash, Paras Umadai, the Persians, Yavan, the Greeks, and Edom, the Romans, who destroyed the second Bet HaMikdash. So the perspective of these four kingdoms really comes into focus through the lens of Sefer Daniel. And I'm going to tell you the story about Sefer Daniel when we go to the kingdom itself, the kingdom of Bavel, which destroyed the Bet HaMikdash. But the main point about this tour is that all of these four kingdoms intersected with Yerushalayim, with our history, and we absorbed many different expressions of those nations. We absorb their history, and we maintain that history with us wherever we go. So when we talk about Yerushalayim being a light to the world, we are carrying parts of the world that are long gone with us and bringing the best parts of them out. So I want us to think about those things, about every single one of those kingdoms and how they fit into our history and how we reflect those things back onto the world. So let's begin with our story. Our story begins with the first kingdom, the kingdom of Bavel. Our first stop, our first kingdom is the kingdom of Babylon, the kingdom of Nebuchadnezzar in Bavel. And the picture that you're seeing of striding lion, these glazed bricks, are from the actual palace of Nebuchadnezzar, which we're going to be visiting very soon. But let's get into the story. Where did we come up with the idea of the four kingdoms? The story of the four kingdoms begins here in Iraq, in what we're seeing here as the ruins of ancient Babylonia. One of the seven wonders of the ancient world is here in Bavel. It is known as the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. But in fact, one of the competitors for the seven wonders of the ancient world was the Ishtar Gates of Babylon of Bavel. Now, I'd like you to pay attention to the way this structure looks, because it's going to be very important for us later. So I'm going to zoom out for a little bit so you see the river. This is Nahar Prat, the Euphrates River. And if you're coming in from Eretz Israel, you have to come in from the north, because you're going all the way around the Fertile Crescent, around the desert, along the water, and you're making your way southward into Bavel. So when you come into Bavel, the first thing you're seeing is the Ishtar Gate, which is the northern gate of Babylonia. And that gate is very, very important because it really conveys the power of Bavel. Now let's get into the story. So we come into Bavel as exiles from Malchut Yehuda, and Daniel is present in the palace of the king, interpreting a dream, very much like the story of Yosef and Paro, except where Paro remembered the dream, but didn't remember the interpretation. Nebuchadnezzar remembered neither. And it's on the shoulders of Daniel to remind him what the dream was and what its interpretation was. And let's look at some pictures to describe what is going on. So I found some really nice pictures on the internet that describe the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, and there's a picture of Daniel looking at it. There's a 16th century German drawing of the dream of Daniel himself, which is the four monsters rising from the ocean, or the visions of Daniel, which correspond to this vision. So I'm going to read the story inside very briefly. In Daniel Perek Bet, we have Daniel standing before Nebuchadnezzar and saying, Ant malka chazeh havat, va'alut tselem chad sagit, tzalma diken ra v'zivei yatir ka'em lekoblach. So you, Nebuchadnezzar, are standing, and before you rises this magnificent statue, Vereved dechil, and it is terrifying. Hu tzalma, this statue, reshedi dehavtav, its head is of pure gold. Chadohi udraohi dichsaf, its shoulders and arms are of silver. Ma'oi v'yalchate dinechash, its torso and hips are of copper or bronze. Shakoi di parzel, and its legs are of iron or steel. Ragloi minhon di parzel minhon dichsaf, and its legs or his feet are a combination of clay and of metal. And what eventually happens, there's this stone that is dislodged without hands involved in it, which is what we see on the black and white drawing. And that stone comes, it smashes the statue on its legs, והדק תימון, and it crushes it into dust. בדין דקו כחדה פרזה לחספה נחשה כספה ודהבה, ואבו כעור מן עדרי קית ונסי מונרוחה, וכל אתר לא ישתכח להון. It gets crushed into dust and spread away like dust in the wind, and there is no remnant of it to be found. And eventually, ואבנה דמחת לצלמה, הבת לטור רב ומלאת כל ערעה. That stone which crushed the statue becomes a large mountain that covers the world. That's the dream. Now, what is the interpretation? Daniel goes ahead and he explains to Nebuchadnezzar in words which remind us of a Shabbat song. See if you can catch them. Ant Malka Melech Malchaya. You are the king, king of kings. Di'ela Shemaya Malchuta Chisna v'takpa v'ikara yahavlach. The God of the heavens has given you all of the power and strength and control. Uvechol didarin bnei enasha, chevat bara ve'of shemaya. Wherever there are people or animals or birds, Yehav beidach ve'ashletach b'cholon. You control everything. Antu resha de dahava. You, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of the world, you are the golden head of the statue. But after you, uvatarach teku malchu achare ar aminach. There's going to be another kingdom that's going to succeed you, umalchut tlita achare de nechasha, and then there's going to be a third kingdom of copper, ditishlat bechol ara, who's going to rule the whole world, umalchu revi'ah te takifa keparzela, and the fourth kingdom is going to be as strong as steel. Kol kavel di parzela ma'adek v'chashel kola, just like iron crushes everything, etc., etc. I'm skipping a little bit ahead. And then finally, when you have this stone which is dislodged and which comes and crushes this statue into powder, that is going to be a future kingdom. וביומהון דמלכה יעינון יקים אלה שמיה מלכות דלעלמין לא תתחבל ומלכותה לעם אחרן לא תשתבק תדק ותסף כל עניין מלכבתה והיא תקום לעולמיה. That stone which crushes this statue of kingdoms, the future kingdoms that will rule the world, that stone, that mountain is going to be a kingdom which will never be supplanted and surpassed and destroyed and ruled by anybody else. Now, in a nutshell, I'm taking you through the Mefarshim, but also the later visions that Daniel has on his own about these four kingdoms. These four kingdoms, which then end up breaking out into more and more smaller kingdoms that don't really mix together like iron and copper, and they end up falling apart internally, perhaps. Those are the four kingdoms we're going to be talking about. The first one is Bavel, which is pure gold. The second is Persia, which is silver. The third is Greece, which is copper or bronze. And the fourth is Rome, Edom, which is steel. Let's talk about Nebuchadnezzar and Bavel, and why he's compared to gold, with a few insights about him and the impact that he's had on Am Yisrael. I would like to take us to a very fascinating museum in Berlin, the Pergamon Museum. The Pergamon Museum is named after one of the seven wonders of the ancient world, which seems to be somewhat of a theme today, and that is the Great Altar of Pergamon, which is part of the Hellenistic kingdom in Turkey. And there's a lot to see in this museum, but I want to take us specifically to see the lions of Nebuchadnezzar from the Ishtar Gate. So let's jump inside into the museum. So welcome to the striding lions, the Ishtar Gate of Babylon. Now I want you to remember that these are the lions in the procession way which we were paraded through as POWs, as prisoners of war, when Yerushalayim was destroyed and captured by Nebuchadnezzar. Now, if we turn a little bit, you'll see that there's a small model here in the center. I'm going to zoom in a little bit so you can see it. And that small model represents the ruins of Babylon reconstructed, rebuilt with this magnificent blue glaze brick imagery of striding lions, and we'll see further ahead also dragons and bulls. So look at the lions. Now, remember that we spoke about a song which is very similar to the words that Daniel says to Nebuchadnezzar, Antu Malka Melech Malchaya. Have you identified the song yet? It's one of my favorite Shabbat songs. It's the 16th century poet Israel Najara, who made his way to Tzfat, lived in Tzfat, and he wrote this song, which is all about how Shabbat helps Am Yisrael stay together and survive the difficulties of Galut. And he takes not only the language of Sefer Daniel, the words of Sefer Daniel, but the imagery of Sefer Daniel to describe HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So for example, Karibon olam ve'almaya antu malka melech malchaya. You are the God, the King of Kings. Now, in the story of Nebuchadnezzar, those are words said about Nebuchadnezzar, but he's taking them and reappropriating them to talk about HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And it goes on to talk about the Galut as a lion. Prok yat anach mipum aryevata. Save your sheep from the mouth of the lion. Amech di bechaot mikol umaya ve'apek yat amech migo galuta. Amech di bechaot mikol umaya. Save your sheep from the mouth of the lion, your nation which you chose above all the other nations, and deliver them. And this is a song which talks about Shabbat, but it also refers to Galut as a lion. How did Galut come to be known as the lion? It's very simple. This is the first Galut. Nebuchadnezzar, Melech Bavel, is represented in Daniel's own visions as a lion. As mentioned in Bereshit Rabbah, Tzadik Bet, it also says that Malchut Yehuda is Keneged Aryeh because of Gur Aryeh Yehuda, and Malchut Bavel is Keneged Aryeh because of Kadmaita K'Aryeh. It's the face of this monster, the forward, and Bavel is Keneged and Aryeh because in Daniel's visions, this monster that he sees, its front is a lion. Now, when you see the archaeology from Nebuchadnezzar, it's staggering because you're seeing 120 lions, and we're going to gradually make our way towards the Ishtar gate itself. Here we are in front of the gates of Nebuchadnezzar. We arrive at these gates as prisoners of war, paraded, humiliated through striding, powerful, victorious lions of Bavel, which destroyed the lion of Yehuda. And the poetic justice, which is expressed in Bereshit Rabbah, is that the destruction of Bavel is also announced by Daniel, who is of the tribe of Yehuda, with the famous writing on the wall. So that's this poetic justice, that Malchut Yehuda, which is a lion, is destroyed by Bavel, which is a lion, who is then destroyed. The announcement of the destruction is brought about by the words of Daniel, who's from Yehuda. So it's this nice play. Now, this gate is the gate which we saw when we were paraded into Bavel, and that's where the story happens. This is the first galut that we experience as Am Yisrael outside of Eretz Yisrael without a Bet HaMikdash. Unlike Assyria, where 10 tribes were deported, but we did still have a Bet HaMikdash. Now, our next stop is going to be in the British Museum, so I would like to take us to the British Museum to wrap up the conversation about Bavel and to transition into Paras. We are jumping now to the British Museum in London. Now, the British Museum on the outside looks very much like the Parthenon of Greece, and we can talk about that on our next stop when we talk about Greece. So in the British Museum, we have another one of those lines of Nebuchadnezzar. Let's go see it. But how does Bavel relate to gold? Remember that the way Daniel describes the vision of Nebuchadnezzar is that he controls and rules everything. And the idea of ruling and controlling everything, that is pure gold. What are the things that we associate with gold? Well, gold is eternal. Gold cannot easily mix with other materials. It's very easy to remove it from other materials at a very low temperature. It's incorruptible. It's eternal. That is the vision that Nebuchadnezzar has about the way the world is supposed to run. Now, the idea is that through the lens of the dreamer of Nebuchadnezzar, the way he views the world is that if you try to rule in any other way, it is inferior to the way that I control the world. I, Nebuchadnezzar, am the top of the pyramid, metaphorically. I control everything, and I am pure gold. However, he was wrong. Let us discuss the Persians. We meet the Persian Empire with Chagai, Zechariah, and Malachi, who are the beginning of Beit Sheni. We meet it in Megillat Esther as well, and we meet the empire as well in Ezra and Nehemiah. The Persian Empire is compared to silver, which means while they are more successful than Nebuchadnezzar in terms of their domination of the world, they control in a manner which he perceives as lesser, which is why they are silver. Let's go back into the British Museum. So we're here in the British Museum, and we are right in front of the Persian galleries, and we are looking at the image of the throne of the king of Persia, possibly Achashverosh, maybe Artaxerxes. And I want us to zoom in for a moment to the top of this relief, which is a copy of a relief from the palace in Persia. look at the image of the king of Persia. We'll call him Achashverosh for the argument because he probably is Achashverosh. First of all, he's sitting with a sharvit, with a scepter. But what's more interesting is that he is a small throne sitting on top of a larger throne. Let's zoom out for a moment and scroll down and see that there is a massive throne with 3 different layers of people holding their hands up, supporting the throne, and each one of them is dressed differently, representing a different nation which is controlled by the throne of Achashverosh, who ruled Mehodu ve'ad Kush, which we're going to see visually very, very soon in the statue of Daryavesh. Before we get there, I want to take you to a very famous piece of archaeology found in Babylon, bit of Cyrus the Great. This is it. This tiny little roller, which could look almost like a paint roller, is one of the most famous pieces of archaeology in the world. The Cyrus cylinder, known also as the first edict of human rights, which we can argue about, is it the first or is it not? But on the scale that he implemented this policy, it definitely is. And the Cyrus cylinder is very similar to the words of Koresh, the same person who speaks in the beginning of Sefer Ezra, at the end of Sefer Divrei Hayamim, granting the Jews in Bavel to return to Yehuda and to rebuild the temple. Now, the content of the Cyrus cylinder is what's interesting, because the content of the Cyrus cylinder has nothing to do with us, only in terms of the policy, which is similar to the policy he gave the captives of Yehuda. But he was referring to other nations captured who were in Bavel and were forced by the previous king of Bavel to worship the god of Babylon, which was not so popular. And comes in the new king and he says, the order of the day is religious freedom and tolerance. I'm going to allow you to build the temples for the gods that you want to. And that's a similar policy to the policy that he enabled us to build the temple with. So that is very important because it's a policy of tolerance, which is very different than the policy of Bavel. And in this and in many other senses, these are policies which would have made Nebuchadnezzar weaker, or so he thinks, but he was wrong. Now, I'd like to discuss a couple more topics that have to do with the Persian Empire. First, we're going to go to the National Museum of Iran in Tehran, which is an incredible thing that we can actually do. So we're looking here at the bird's eye view of the museum, but I want to take us into the museum to meet the father of Achashverosh, Daryavesh, Darius the Great. Behold this headless statue. The statue that we're looking at, first of all, before we zoom in, I want you to notice that it's the way he's standing, right, looks very much like a pharaoh. And the stone that he's made of is a stone that was brought from Egypt. This was made in Egypt. So this is a hint to the scope of control that the Persian Empire had, Mehodu ve'ad Kush. But to really appreciate that, I want us to zoom in a little bit further. If you'll notice, a little bit off to the right, there's a painting reconstructing the palace of Achashverosh in Shushan, a palace which, based on the inscriptions we know, was built by Daryavesh, whose statue we're looking at, and his son Achashverosh. And I go into a lot more depth about this on a special tour for Purim, but this is just an overview. So I'm zooming in a little bit, and I want you to see that at the base of the statue are hieroglyphics and imagery which comes from Egypt. So this is taken from Egypt, which was encompassed in Mehodu ve'ad Kush, because Kush is south of Egypt. And what's more impressive is, if you look closely, first of all, there's several different languages here. We'll talk about that in just a moment. There's hieroglyphics on the bottom, and we're going to scroll up or move upward and look on the folds of the gown, and you'll see on one side hieroglyphics, and on the other side cuneiform, which is very likely to be in 3 different languages: Akkadian, Elamite, and Old Persian. I want to take you just to the side to look at the images underneath the feet of Daryavesh. Now, based on what we've seen in the British Museum, can you guess what we would expect to see underneath the feet of the ruler of the world, of the Persian Empire? Of course, images of people. Now, each one of these people represents a different nation, which is written in hieroglyphics, and the way their dress and hair is styled represents the nation that they are from. At the bottom of the statue is an image, which I'm going to enlarge and show you here on the screen. And this image takes the map of the Persian Empire and places every one of those figures on their appropriate location, which gives you the massive scope of the Persian Empire, which raises a few questions. How on earth, or what other planet, would the Persian Empire maintain control of such a vast empire? If you look at it like the king of Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, tight fist, absolute control, everybody speaks the same language, worships the same gods, and that's gold. That's eternal. However, the Persian Empire realized that if you want people to pay taxes and you want them not to rebel, then you have to give them a little bit of the carrot as well and come forward and enable them to be part of the kingdom without it being so much of a hassle other than paying taxes. But imagine having to pay taxes and paying a notary and a translator just to submit all the forms in the proper language, like in Babylon. The Persian Empire had a solution for that, which has to do with languages. I'm going to show you that in just a moment. But before we do that, I want to talk about one more thing, which has to do with distance and the travel speed of information. So we're going to go for a moment back into the museum. Now, we're turning around for a moment, and I want you to see that this is a map in the museum of the Persian Empire, and at the center of the map is a dot representing Shushan Habira, the city of Shushan, with a red line which goes all the way to western Turkey to the city known as Sardis, where there is a large synagogue from a later period of time, but it's the largest synagogue in the world. I recommend looking up the Sardis synagogue. The road from Susa to Sardis, under normal circumstances, would take about 3 months to travel. If you want to control a massive empire like the Persian Empire, I'm sorry, but no can do. That takes way too long. What the Persians did was they were able to condense that travel time by having a messenger system where there are fresh horses waiting at the next station, and all you have to do is switch horses, and every once in a while, you can rest if you need to as well. You have 24 hours to rest, but they were able to shrink that distance to 7 days, 1 week. From 3 months, which is a quarter of a year, to 1 week. That is the incredible speed of the Persian messenger system, which is hinted throughout the Megillah. והרצים יצאו דחופים בדבר המלך, ורוכבי הרכש האחשתרנים יצאו מבוהלים ודחופים. Like, it's so over the top, or so it seems. But it's a very accurate reflection of many aspects of the Persian Empire. So I want you to see this image from the United States Postal Office in New York City, right across the street from Madison Square Garden. And there's a very famous quote on top of it, which is the motto of the United States Postal Service. The motto of the United States Postal Service, neither rain nor shine nor gloom of night will stay these couriers from delivering their appointed task. Something like that. More or less, I'm paraphrasing, but that quote is from Herodotus, the Greek historian, describing the speed of the messengers of Achashverosh in his battle against the Greeks and the road from Susa to Sardis, Shushan to Sardis. That is incredible that should be the United States Postal Service motto. Amazing. And here's where I want to wrap up and transition us to the final point of the Persian Empire, which has to do with many languages. We're going to be jumping to the hill of Behistun, one of the many hills in Persia. Behistun is a very high hill. It's a high mountain, more accurately. And on the side of the mountain is carved an inscription by Darius the Great, which describes how he ascended the throne, which is a great story for another time. But what's important about that carving, and I'm going to show you the picture right here, is that carving is written in 3 different languages. And there's another 500 lines of text that go down, but for the photo, it's not so interesting. There's an image here on the left of Daryavesh with supporters behind him, and in front of him and under his feet are his enemies, which he conquered in ascending to the throne. And this is, of course, done under the blessing of Ahura Mazda, the god of Persia. And all of this text shows up in 3 languages. In Persian, well, Old Persian, in Elamite, from Elam, and in Akkadian, which was the official language of the Babylonian Empire. Now, this is something which is unique to the Persian Empire, and which Nebuchadnezzar would not have conceived of as being effective, and yet it was very effective and enabled him to rule more of the world, which is why he's considered to be silver, because it's a lesser material. But in terms of the pyramid as being the top of the pyramid, which is gold, you move down the pyramid, it's silver, it's multiculturalism, it's a multilingual administration. Really cool. Now let's talk about our third kingdom, which is the Greeks. We meet the Greeks on Hanukkah. We meet them with Alexander the Great coming into Eretz Yisrael and the subsequent naming of all the boys that year as Alexander, which becomes a Jewish name. The Hellenistic culture. We just saw the British Museum, which looks like the Parthenon, which we see in the background. And we saw the James Farley building, the United States Postal Service, which is about the Persian wars against the Greeks. But the building style, the architecture of the post office building is Greek. So it's really interesting how we have both of those right there. Now, if we say Mitzion tetzeh Torah udvar Hashem Yerushalayim, that Torah comes forth to the world out of Yerushalayim, you can say that Western culture comes out of Athens. And so there are many who talk about Athens and Jerusalem being the morals that come out of the Tanakh are spread throughout the world, whether through Christianity, Judaism, however it is, they made their way into the world, but they come from Torah and Yerushalayim ultimately, whereas the culture, the philosophy, and so many other aspects of the West come from Athens. So we are going to the Parthenon in Athens to see the source. So welcome to Greece. This is the Parthenon, the Acropolis, the highest point in the city, which was where they had the temple for Athena and the temple for Poseidon. But the important thing about this, I want to turn around a little bit so you can see it, is that the architecture is typical of a Western cultural building. Whether it's the Brooklyn Museum, the British Museum, the Boston Fine Arts Museum, the Thomas Jefferson Rotunda, Capitol Hill, the architecture comes from the Greek world. The Greeks had a profound impact on the world, whether it's in terms of sports, the Olympics, competition, in terms of philosophy, in terms of literature. We learn about Greek tragedy and Greek literature until today as part of Common Core, part of curriculum. And of course, the idea of beauty, which is a tremendous point of conflict about beauty, because they looked at beauty as the whole body, as opposed to Brit Milah, which is taking nature and saying, we're going to take it a step further. That was like the main point of contention between the Greeks and the Jews in the time of Hanukkah. Now, if we want to talk about what it is about the Greeks that is, so to speak, further down the pyramid, or a lesser material, which is copper, we have to understand something about the way they looked at decision-making and control, which of course is democracy. Democracy means handing over control to the people. Now, it's not the democracy of the West today. That's a much more evolved democracy, because in the Greek world, it was only free Greek men who owned the states. It wasn't women, it wasn't slaves, it wasn't other citizens, something that changed in the Roman Empire, and they did have citizenship. However, I want to focus on a couple of things in the Greek Empire and the Greek culture. And to do that, I'm going to take us to another Greek building in the United States, the Boston Museum of Fine Arts, the Boston MFA. Let's go to Boston. And boom, we're in the United States. Welcome to the MFA. Remember the connection to the architecture of the Parthenon. That's what we're looking at. That's why we're showing you the outside before we zoom in. I'm going to take you to a very special gallery, which is called Daily Life in Ancient Greece. Think of what is the most important story in Greek mythology. What do you think that would be? The story that is displayed here is the Battle of Troy, the Trojan Wars, which is told by Homer. And if we turn to the right for a moment, you'll see that there is a statue of Homer right here, because Homer is the famous Greek historian who told this story. But let's turn back to the left and look at this display. The display here from left to right shows you the entire story of the Battle of Troy on household dishes, on jewelry, on mirrors, on rings, on coins. Why? Greek mythology carries the values which were important to the Greeks. And they made sure to put those values on so many different things. They conveyed those values through paintings on walls, through their sports and their pagan worship, and on household dishes. Because that's how you spread a message. It's visual, it's exciting, it's a conversation starter. And the importance of the Trojan War is that in Greek mythology, that is the origin story of the Greek nation. So of course it's going to be an important story that's all over the place. It's reinforcing the story. And when we think about the effect, the impact that the Greeks had on the West until today, you can understand that it's far beyond the impact that the Babylonians had. Even though the Babylonians had their fair share of influence, even the fact that minutes have 60 seconds, and we say things like batel b'shishim, like that 60 is a number unit as opposed to the decimal system, right? That's Babylonian 360 degrees. I mean, there's all kinds of interesting things, the names of the month, which we brought from Bavel, Nisan, Iyar, Sivan, and there's a lot more. But this is something that's felt everywhere today. The idea of superheroes, mythology, origin stories, culture, philosophy, the arts, right? That's very much an impact that comes from the Greeks. We're going to turn around 180 degrees and look at the other end of the gallery. This display, again on Greek earthenware, on amphorae, as it's called, like kleanporia, except these kleanporia, unlike the ones in Baba Metzia, are very unique, so you would have to actually announce them, so you'd be chayav le'achriz. But these amphorae tell the story of the famous Greek tragedies. Now, the Greek tragedies, the idea of Greek tragedy is that it shows you how tiny the human being is compared to the gods. So anyone who would dare challenge the gods and try to do things differently, other than to glorify the gods through the perfection of the human body and the Olympics and all that stuff, would be punished by the gods. So let's give a few examples. I'm sure you've heard of Sisyphus, the king Sisyphus who tried to defy Hades, defy Zeus, is punished forever to push a rock up the hill and for that rock to go down. As we say even in Hebrew, avodah sisyphit, right? Sisyphus. We have Arachnia, the spindler who rivaled the gods, and Athena came down to earth and punished her, turning her into a spider who will spin her webs forever because you think you're greater than me. And then we have, of course, Orpheus who plays music and he wants to be able to take his beloved out of hell, but he turns around and she runs away. I mean, again and again and again, we find human beings being small, puny, and full of failures in compare to the gods. So that's a very important aspect of Greek culture, which is the complete opposite of Brit Milah and Jewish culture. But in terms of the vision of Nebuchadnezzar, we have the top of the pyramid, which is pure gold, absolute control, moving down to silver, which is multiculturalism, many different languages, religious tolerance, and moving down to copper, which is a lesser metal, and that represents democracy, again, according to the philosophical suggestion that I'm laying out here. Obviously, there are more ways to look at this. On that note, I want to take us to our final stop, which is both Edom, Esav, the brother of Yaakov, but also the West today, and that is Edom, Rome. What comes to mind when you think about Rome? How do Chazal refer to Rome? Sometimes they're called Edom, sometimes Esav, and sometimes Ummah HaResha'a. We've had times in which we got along with the Romans, and those are seen as connected to when Esav says to Yaakov, Elcha lenigdecha. But there are also times where they control Yaakov and dominate Yaakov, as Yaakov gives them control and says, Yavona Adoni lifnei avdo v'ani et nahala leiti. So this relationship which Chazal see between Edom and Israel to Yaakov and Esav is a very important one to understand, because the blessing that Esav gets is al charbecha tichyeh. You will live by the sword. And that is related to amatakifa keparzela, as Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar, a nation which is as tough as steel. And that has to do with the West, with everything from their sword back then to the Industrial Revolution, to machinery, to getting things done, to these are incredible things which are expressing themselves more today. Now, I want to take us to the iconic image of Rome, which is, of course, the Colosseum and the Arch of Titus. So we are now in Italy, in Rome, and hovering above the Colosseum. And I want to share with you a couple of things about the Colosseum, the Arch of Titus, and of course to talk about something that relates a little bit more to Bar Kochva, Lag BaOmer, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Shimon Bar Kochva, and that neighborhood in the Israel Museum. We'll talk about that soon, and I have a surprise for you at the end, so hang in, we're almost there. So in terms of Rome, the Colosseum, we look at the destruction of the Second Temple, Churban Bayit Sheni, and we came from the destruction of Bayit Rishon with Nebuchadnezzar. We are now several hundred years later at the destruction of Bayit Sheni by Vespasian and Titus. A recent discovery tells us how the Colosseum was financed. And I want to show you this plaque that was discovered by Banca di Roma a few good years ago. And if you look at the plaque, you'll see that there is Latin text on it from a much later renovation of the Colosseum, which of course needed maintenance and was renovated and expanded. But if you look closely, you'll notice that there are holes in different parts of the inscription. Those holes were holes which originally held these metal letters which were hammered into those holes. So for example, if you have 3 letters in the shape of an A, you know that there was an A hammered into there. Now there's a beautiful article about this which I can link in the description, which talks about the letters that were originally there based on an expert, of course, who was able to reconstruct the letters and the inscription based on those holes. And the inscription says that the Colosseum was financed by the spoils of Jerusalem. I wouldn't be surprised as well if they were built with slave labor from Jerusalem, but it was built by Vespasian and his son Titus. So we think of Rome and we think of the Colosseum and the Arch of Titus, but those are symbols of our destruction. Further down the Colosseum is the Via Sacra, which is where there was a procession way back in the day where Jews were paraded with the spoils from Jerusalem, and a Sefer Torah is described by Josephus, and they were paraded in Rome, humiliated, and eventually Titus built this arch in order to commemorate that procession and the destruction of Jerusalem. Now, he did that, of course, for his personal propaganda reasons. He wanted support of the people for the Flavian dynasty, and that's all very nice. But the symbol of our destruction is the Arch of Titus. And the image of the Arch of Titus, now here is a colorful image, a reconstruction of the Arch of Titus, which is based on a project by Yeshiva University, the Arch of Titus in color, and they scanned it. Not only did they make a 1-to-1 3D model of it, which is currently in the YU campus in Washington Heights, but they also found traces of the yellow, of the gold, of the menorah, and the rest of the colors are based on studies of the Roman palette that was familiar. We don't really know 100%. This is an estimation. However, the symbol of the menorah became iconic through this picture. And the state of Israel in 1948 took this image and turned it into the symbol of our Geula. From Churban to Geula, from our humiliation and destruction to hope and redemption and rebuilding. And this is the emblem of the state of Israel. We have 2 more stops to make to wrap up our tour. The first one is in the Israel Museum, so hold on to your seatbelts because we're jumping into the Israel Museum in Jerusalem in 3, 2, 1, go. Welcome to the Israel Museum, and we're looking at a bust, a copper or bronze statue of Hadrianus Caesar, Hadrian, who suppressed the Bar Kokhba revolt. I'm going to turn slowly to the left so that you can see other parts that have to do with this story. So, in the first display, you're seeing items that were found in different caves, Nachal Chever, Nachal Tze'elim, different caves around Ein Gedi and the Judean hills, where the Jews hid away from the Romans as part of the revolt. There's wineskins, there's valuables, glass, metal, clothes, coin collections, and all kinds of beautiful things. They even locked the door and took the key with them, hoping, of course, to come back home, which they didn't because here are the keys. They're called elbow keys. Can you see them? If I turn further around, you'll see that there's a small display of coins, the famous Bar Kochva coins, which have an image of the Beit HaMikdash, of Elulav and Etrog, the Chatzotzrot, the Nevel, all kinds of things which express the yearning to rebuild the Beit HaMikdash a mere 60 years after its destruction. And this was something which they attempted to do to regain control of Jerusalem, which they did for a brief time, but after that destruction, it's all over. And the relationship with the Romans, of course, goes back and forth, because the Mishnah was written in the time of the Roman Empire with Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, but then there was persecution, and then the Roman Empire becomes the Byzantine Empire, at least the eastern part. So Israel becomes Christian, and they pursue the Jews, and then they become the West. So Edom becomes the West, and then finally the United States. We look at this as a continuity. Why is that important? Because we are now in the final stages of the history and the vision that's expressed in the statue and in the visions of Daniel, which is the crumbling of the Malchuyot, the crumbling of Malchut Edom as well, whose impact has lasted for thousands of years, and they are now the West. Now, I'm going to take that for granted. We don't have the time to unpack how we know Esav and it is Edom, is Rome is the West. I'm going to take that for granted now. But it's very well established, it's known. And I want to take us to the one place that really expresses how Edom is the bottom of the pyramid and where it's going to completely change from top down to bottom up at this point. And for that, I want to take you to one of those things which you say, if there's anywhere you go in the world, you're going to find two things: a Chabad house and Coca-Cola. I want to take you to the Museum of Coca-Cola, the World of Coke in Atlanta, Georgia. Let's go. And here it is, the World of Coke. I had an art teacher in the old city where I grew up, and her husband would never drink Coca-Cola because of their Hebrew commercial, which is Ta'am HaChaim, Coca-Cola. He's like, I'll be damned if I will acknowledge anything other than Torah being Ta'am HaChaim. So this was his ideological issue with Coca-Cola. But I'd like to wrap up here with Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola's color is red. Red, Esav, Edom. It's an interesting coincidence, isn't it? Right? Because the idea of Coca-Cola is comfort at arm's length. I don't want to have to work hard. I want to have my cold Coke wherever I am. That's really the essence of their commercials, right? This expresses Edom, the West, so beautifully, because the idea of Edom is to use the world to give you the comfort that you want. And you talk about the American dream and the pursuit of happiness. You talk about being comfortable with things. Like, that's such a contemporary conversation to say, like, I'm comfortable, I'm not comfortable with these ideas. They come out of America. They come out of the modern West. So it's a beautiful thing. And the most important thing about the bottom of the pyramid and where we are now at in history is not only the Edict of Citizenship from the year 212 under Emperor Caracalla, who may be the Antoninos of Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, fits in the right time, but it's the idea of globalization. It's not just the multiculturalism, which is relative multiculturalism of the Persians. This is the bottom of the pyramid. It's complete opposite of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. It's bottom up, not top down. It's self-organization. It's people saying, like, we're fed up with a particular system. We're going to make the difference by getting together and making the change. We're not going to expect the government to take care of it for us. I mean, this is what the internet and globalization and all these things have enabled to happen. That's where we are at now, where governments are not working like they used to work. That's the vision that Nebuchadnezzar had, and which he actually tried to counteract by then making a statue of pure gold, which didn't really turn out so well. But this vision of Daniel, the vision of the statue, is a vision that really brings the relevance of those four Malchuyot, which live through us. We can talk about Nebuchadnezzar and Sancheriv and Paro and Antiochus and Titus, and we can talk about these people like they're footnotes to our history. It's such an incredible thing that they're alive through us, and we bring the lessons that are learned from them to the world. So I hope you've enjoyed the Four Kingdoms. I hope you explore more about this. Reach out. So, there's so much more that we can do. If you have any questions, I'm going to try to link some information down below. Like this YouTube video, of course. Clicking that like is very important. And I hope you be in touch. And we have many more incredible learning Tanakh on the map together. And until next time.